All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kata Beilin, Faculty Director of LASIS, and I have a great pleasure to welcome everyone today to the first lecture in the new series that we are beginning this spring, Visualizing Hispanic World. And I'm very happy that it's precisely Professor Egea who is giving the first lecture in this series, because one of the many memorable sentences that I remember Professor Egea saying to me and to his students was that one image can say more than 100 or maybe it is 1,000 words. And this is not the only thing I have learned from Professor Egea during our common teaching in Spanish department. I have appreciated an enormous quality of his work. Read his books. First of them was focused on Spanish poetry, titled Poesía de nosotros, and was the story of the poetry of Jaime Gil de Biedma. The second book, published in 2013, was titled Dark Laughter. And in this book, focused on Spanish cinema, Professor Egea suggested that films, dark comedies, can be interpreted as interventions in political issues. And he also treated dark comedies as a very specific genre to Spanish national cinema. So I believe that this book, there are reasons to think, is growing out of the 2013 book on Spanish film. And I am very much looking forward to listening to it, to listening to Juan's presentation. I'm sure that we will all learn a lot. So without taking any more time, I am going to pass the word to Professor Egea.
Thank you, Kata. Thank you, Sara, Alberto. Thank you to everybody at LASIS. I'm happy and grateful to be able to present my book. Happy for the invitation. I'm also a little bit embarrassed. Embarrassed to be presenting a book that was published 2 years ago. It's like having a baby and telling all your friends when the baby is off to college. I don't know how the book to human age ratio works. I know that a 2-year dog is 22 years in human, 24 if the dog is small. My book has only 170 pages, so it is definitely out of college and looking for a job. To compensate for that 2-year delay, I'm not going to present the book once, but 4 times. It's the least I can do. I still want to stick to 35-40 minutes, but I'm going to present it 4 times. And I'm going to just share my screen right now, if I can. As I was saying, there are 4 presentations. The first one basically is a basic presentation. It covers the basics. For instance, the title, as you can see, with this made up word in the first part, and then this promise of companionship. I'll talk about that a little bit more in my second presentation. The basics of this presentation also covers the skeleton of this graduating baby, the table of contents. As you can see, after the first chapter in which I do kind of an introduction to all the problems, issues, disciplinary and institutional aspects of what it means to study Hispanism and what does it mean to add film to the equation. And then it's organized around 2 dichotomies or 2 oppositions, if you will. Art cinema versus popular cinema, and then national cinema versus transnational cinema. That allows me, of course, to talk about authorism, canon formation, cinemas, cultural industry, popular film as an arena of consent and contestation, generic modalities, historical memory, the financial crisis. It's, again, not your usual companion in which you can usually you proceed chronologically or thematically, but again, is articulated around these two overarching dichotomies. The third point in this basic presentation, the book only has one footnote, and it's a footnote that's telling you that that's it, that there are no more footnotes. I can invoke as precedent Eric Auerbach writing My Messes in Istanbul with no bibliography and no endnotes, although his circumstances were more dramatic. He had to flee Nazi Germany and ended up in Istanbul with no books. I could also invoke the reference of the late Maria Rosa Menocal, who wrote Shards of Love, and that's the first book I encountered in which scholarship wasn't measured by the number of footnotes one can master. But I prefer to invoke the Argentinian writer Raúl Walsh. He has a short story called precisely Nota al Pie and footnote. And it's a text that starts with the regular text and just a little footnote, and then you proceed reading, and the footnote begins to eat the body of the text until there is no text left almost. And that was my fear with this project, a project that approaches the whole Spanish cinema. What I'm saying there, footnotes run the risk of becoming bibliographic dumping areas. So what I'm doing is just engaging, disagreeing, agreeing with my colleagues in the body of the text and not in footnotes or endnotes. Again, just a quirk of the book. The last basic aspect of this first presentation regarding my book is that it goes $160. Don't buy, just get it out of the library. Ask me for the PDF or the proofs, because that's the other thing. I don't have many copies. I guess that is, I think everybody book presentation should have a reflection on by the author on how much of a commodity it is and how much this publishing house has made it a book that it will have to be photocopy if it wants to reach graduate students, I guess. Anyway, I'll try to find another publishing house next time that has open access. That's the end of my first presentation. The second presentation is a flash presentation. It's going to be short again. It's only about, it consists of quotes from the book. Quotes that I'm not even going to read, because stretching a little bit more my initial analogy, the book is all enough to speak for himself. And the first thing he's going to say is this. I love concepts. They are both fun and scholarly. They also have to be justified because they run the risk of appearing shallow. And the book itself is trying to make this concept a valid name for a discipline, is justifying why do we need to use Filmspanism, preferring it to any other. On that, my book also has this to say. Let me tell you a little bit about the troubles my book is talking about here. Cultural nationalism, hegemonic fantasies, essentialist undertones, ideological agendas, outmoded disciplinarity, meta-signifier anxiety. All those are a handful of the problems that one can encounter if he chooses to use the Hispanism as a suffix for this term. I could have used Hispanic film studies, but I felt that that's just add an adjective to established field of studies. And what I like about Filmspanism is that it make me confront the reality that we have been doing with films very different things that others in communication arts or film studies programs. And we have been using literary criticism, film theory, visual studies, cultural history, sociology, philosophy, art history, media, and yes, media studies too. So Filmspanism was the choice for me, a little bit as a provocation, mainly because the conceptual and ideological issues that such a name brings to the surface or make us confront. Now, a project with this title is interested, after all, in this. And again, I'm letting my book speak for itself. I like the expression geopolitics of knowledge. I took it from Walter Mignolo he uses in a different context. Although I like geopolitics as a word, I keep on using it more and more. Or to put it in simpler terms and using a sentence from Brad Epps, my old professor, I'm interested here in the places where people work and from which they speak and write. And even in more simpler terms, simpler terms, I'm interested in the connection between places and thinking. That will summarize this statement by my book, that also has this to say about the second part of the title. This is a companion, although there is no wager of totality here. It's not an exhaustive companion. It maps space of possibilities. Don't look for a chapter on Almodóvar. Don't look for a chapter on Spanish cinema under Franco, although Almodóvar is there and Francoism and film are mentioned. That has been done again, and you could just go to Buñuel, Berlanga, Saura, Gutiérrez Aragón, Erice, Almodóvar, and do the usual thing. But again, I was more interested in something at the end like this. And as you can see, my book has not only gone to college, but picked up some academic lingo in the process. And he has definitely read Foucault. Now, that's the end of my second presentation. As you can see, we are just cruising along. The third presentation of my book is going to be a Petsakucha presentation. A Japanese word that probably I'm mispronouncing. It's a Japanese word that means chit chat. It also makes reference to a style of presentation created in 2003 by architects, and it's also called a 2020 presentation. 20 slides, 20 images, 20 seconds per slide. So 6 minutes and 40 seconds of presentation. It was designed to just fight the death by PowerPoint effect. When done well, it's like poetry. It's the haiku of academic presentations. When done well, you are supposed to memorize the text that you're going to speak. I didn't do that. So if you look at the slides and not at me reading, we can all preserve the illusion that I committed all these words to memory. So there we go. At the beginning, there was a 1983 issue of Quarterly Review of Film Studies and a series of monographs with uplifting, sunny titles like Blood Cinema and Kane on Screen. Spanish cinema, the one worth writing about, was born under the sign of Saturn in the middle of a dictatorship, underdeveloped, underappreciated, and French. It was an auteur cinema, though, un cine de autor. And academics at both sides of the Atlantic aspire to find the equals of the country's canonical novels in film. So the object of the study was a corpus of film, not an industry. At some point, the need was felt to find a foundational fiction, an origin, the first Spanish film even. And one silent film, La Aldea Maldita, was chosen, a film that had it all. A Castilian setting that referred back to the generation of 98, a Calderonian plot providing some golden age prestige, plus some formal achievements not found in the so-called españoladas that precede and surround the film. Españoladas, by the way, is a pejorative term used during these foundational moments of early Spanish film, a term also used in the 60s and 70s to refer to films that were both too vernacular and too shallow, and for Spanish audiences, badly done. During these foundational moments in the discipline, scholars in Spanish departments still focused on dissident films made during the dictatorship, with particular attention to the so-called new Spanish cinema, one that was a little bit more French. There was even a push to find a poetic cinema in Spain, whatever that means, because we all know that the adjective poetic names many vague things, both in movie theaters and in life. Soon, or rather later, popular cinema finally became a valid object of study, but the approach was then different. Sociology enters the picture with as much trepidation as film studies did in the field of Hispanism. These are the most watched, the most profitable, the most popular films in the history of Spanish cinema since the 1950s. They are all objectively, irrevocably, unquestionably bad movies. And yes, the question of quality still has some purchase in my analysis. Bad films with a large audience is an operative category in this book, which leads to reflections on the uses of sociology, arenas of consent and contestation, and the possibilities of semiotic resistance. And then, in this two-pronged discussion of what is worth studying as a national cinema, there is the inevitable question of national cinema itself, the concept film scholars love to hate. These are the most representative books of the second wave of Filmspanism, books that acknowledge that it's almost impossible to write about Spanish national cinema only to proceed to do precisely that. Where do we put the nation is the question. We usually put it in the title. Now, Rick Allman once wondered what genre films can tell us about nations. So maybe genre filmmaking can be the key to unlock questions of national cinema. Thinking about the obvious ones, the connection between genre and nation seems promising. I took Allman's wondering to heart when I identified the Civil War Spanish film as a potential candidate to be the national genre in Spain. Then I did some wondering on my own when I tackled what El Espinazo del Diablo and El Laberinto del Fauno do to or undo in this very domestic and endogaming film genre. Both films use fantasy, both by a Mexican director. They are both Spanish films in the very precise way government administrators determine nationality in a cultural product. With only 20 seconds to read all these, I can tell you right now that 75% of Spanishness in authors, and the authors are the director, the cinematographer, the scriptwriter, and the composer, and 75% of cast and crew is enough, plus some minor dispositions regarding languages and locations. And of course, in the face of all this conceptualization of Spanish cinema still as basically blood cinema, there is this really new Spanish cinema that says, hey, do you want genre filmmaking that is not national, that doesn't go back to the same foundational trauma, that is not even in Spanish or in Basque, in Galician, in Catalan? Do you want thrillers, horror movies? Do you want production values? There you go. And please do not say that these films are so well done that they don't seem Spanish. Some of these films are even Hollywood-inspired narratives, like El Desconocido, suspiciously similar to a film like Speed, and destined to be remade at the other side of the Atlantic. We are selling back to Hollywood the thrills that Hollywood sold to us long ago. In the end, yes, Spanish cinema is a construct, like the title of this book, and always already national and transnational enterprise, as much art as it is entertainment. In the end, what we do with it betrays a, wait for it, geopolitics of knowledge, connecting places to thinking, questioning what Hispanism has to gain or to forego in committing to the study of the moving image. And then again, maybe we should not be talking about film, but about screens. I know my concept is barely 2 years old, and I'm already proposing a new, uglier one. So let's stop there. Hold your virtual applause, because this is the end of the third presentation. The fourth presentation is going to be a more conventional one. Am I doing good with time? Yes. As I said, the book covers some terrain, deals with Spanish cinema in general, but in every chapter I dig deeper. I engage with movies like case studies. In the first chapter is La Aldea Maldita as a foundational fiction. In the second chapter are two movies, El Sol de Membrillo and Tren de Sombras by Erice and Guerin. Popular cinema has all those, I deal with all those movies I show you, from El Último Cuplé to Ocho Apellidos Vascos. The genre nation is those two movies by Del Toro. And then in the last chapter about transnational cinema, at some point there is a discussion of the thriller and the Spanish crisis. So I'm not going to read from the book, but I made a potpourri or a condensation of what I did there. And again, fourth and last presentation. El Desconocido, 100 años de perdón, El Reino, set against the backdrop of the nation's 2008 economic crisis, these films offer their cinematic fantasies of retribution through the action thriller formula. That is the political corruption and financial malfeasance at the root of a social trauma becomes fuel for an entertainment industry that makes audiences fantasize about a moment of reckoning. Yet all these entertaining films also contribute to what I would like to call the visuality of the crisis, where pictures of derelict spaces, dumpster, scavenging, and dramatic foreclosures coexist with images of corrupt politicians on vacation after being indicted, that's Mariano Rato, or one of my favorites, the country's prime minister giving a press conference via plasma TV. The thrillers in questions are then part of a mediascape, and that's a term taken from Arjun Appadurai. A mediascape already saturated with images of power and precarity in a rather unstable dynamic. While it will be excessive to link these films to any strain of social cinema, they do have more than an anecdotal crematistic presence within the visual representations that effectively mediate such a devastating moment in the social fabric of the nation. So let's talk about the Spanish thriller for a second. Its commercial and critical success begins in the 1990s. Días Contado is the first thriller nominated for a Goya in the Best Film category and the first to win it since the award's creation in 1986. The Goyas are the equivalent of the Oscars in Spain, but named after a famous painter instead of an anonymous person. I don't know who Oscar is. The following year, Nadie hablará de nosotras cuando hayamos muerto receives the same honor. However, it is in the 2010s when the action thriller signals its arrival. Directors like Daniel Monzón, Enrique Urbizu, and Vicente Rodríguez produce nominated and award-winning thrillers that rely on a type of cinematic thrill that, in addition, and to put it simply, is well done. Technical prowess, Hollywood-like proficiency, and transnational looks are indeed among the most important aspects that get praised and rewarded in these films. Films like El Niño, No habrá paz para los malvados, o La Isla Mínima. 2016 is even hailed as the year of the Spanish thriller. Spanish cinema can be transnationally generic. It can be popular, slick, competitive. It does not need to look Spanish, whatever that means. The obvious irony here is that the boom of the action thriller and its lavish production values coincides with this moment of national disaster that in turn produces its own succession of images that reframe the nation as ruination and everyday angst. More than escapism is at stake when the action thriller is hauled up to scrutiny against the background of that image-producing event that is the nation in crisis. Spanish cinema contribution to this effective mediation of the crisis is certainly diverse. There are a series of documentaries, and Mercado de Futuros is probably one of the most raw and subtle. There are numbers of short films, arguably more dynamic and democratic in its production model, channels of distribution, and modalities of consumption. And these short films, and I'm looking at you, Ricardo, present a healthy body of visual responses and reworkings of the crisis experience. Within the most conventional feature film production, there is a crisis cinema, broadly described by Dean Albritton as films that engage, and I quote, engage with or confront what it means to live in crisis. The ideas on this particular type of cinema, usually dramas, owe greatly to the so-called cinema of precarity, a concept coined by Laurent Berland. In her discussion of this cinema of precarity, the linkage between a moment of reaching a critical situation and the limits of what is there to be imagined, to be fantasized about, seems to be the most fruitful reflection, as I think of the possibility of considering these action thrillers as a cinema of crisis, too, and not only as an exploitative entertainment. In this context, film must be understood less as an analysis of a given social reality and more as a visual means to effectively mediate it. A case in point would be, of course, that unscrupulous banker in El Desconocido bound for Hollywood, and the disturbing fantasy of making him pay, making him suffer. So, since this is a presentation about action cinema, let's cut to the chase and use this film as case study. By the time El Desconocido is released, the Spanish crisis is supposed to be reaching its end. Short after it premiered, the New York Times declares Spain's long economic nightmare finally over. The article does not mention the more than 60,000 evictions that took place during that very same year. And evictions are still happening in Spain. Now it's not owners, but renters even are being evicted. So the crisis is far from over to some extent. The macroeconomic numbers match the ongoing assault on social services and the worsening of living and working conditions for large sections of the population. Precarity and inequality are two of the pillars on which the country's alleged recovery stands. Impunity is the third one. In spite of a couple of high-profile indictments and judicial processes, the feeling that those truly responsible for the loss of savings, homes, and lives have not been punished persists. Make them pay is a common refrain expressed with different formulations. El Desconocido is particularly excruciating in its fantasy of personal retribution. It tells the story of Carlos, a crooked investing bank manager that finds himself trapped in his car with his two children. The vehicle has been rigged to explode if the occupants leave their seats. An unknown caller demands a ransom that ultimately amounts to a monetary reparation of what that person lost to the predatory banking practices led by Carlos himself. After a series of plot twists that include thrilling police chases and tense standoffs, the genre delivers. The character constantly placed in impossible, life-threatening situations survives, and, spoiler alert, the mad bomber dies. Before that, the unscrupulous financier gets to ask forgiveness from his family and from his blackmailer. In a highly symbolic and definitely obvious scene, he even gets to wash blood off his hands in the rain. By the end of the film, the redeemed banker will be on his mobile phone again, driving a much cheaper car and declining an offer to rejoin the financial institution that used to employ him. In El Desconocido, then, the financial crisis is figured as a revenge play, delivered in the cinematic visuals of Hollywood, where the generic pleasures of the action thriller are both satisfying and disturbing. The victim of systematic banking abuse becomes the crazed subject. In other words, the character that functions as a stand-in for all of those Spaniards cheated out of their life savings turns mourning into homicidal rage. On the other hand, the crooked banker is the character to pity, and in the kinetic and effective economy of the action thriller formula, he is also the character for whom to root. It would be easy to spurn this film for the moral arc of its plot, the ethics of its representation, or its rather questionable social critique. As more and more victims of and protesters in Spain are derided as insane or seen as a menace by politicians and the press, the depiction of this unreasonable, lethal victim-turned-villain appears to be at best troubling and at worst reactionary. The evil banker deserves more empathy than condemnation, and his eventual redemption comes through a personal trauma, somewhat similar to the one he has inflicted on others. And yet, in this particular genre, isn't the fan supposed to be in the chase, in the twists and turns of the cinematic thrill? How much enjoyment was there to be had with the spectacle of a trapped, suffering banker? To what public desire of retribution is the symbolic punishment appealing? What primal fantasies are fulfilled as they unravel on the unreal space of the screen? It has been established that in the genre, the thrilling becomes, and in this genre, the thrilling becomes an end on itself, and that it emphasizes gut-level feelings rather than more cerebral ones. The thrill was surely in the action, in the continuous frenetic editing. The thrill was in the fantasy of retribution, in the vengeance exacted to such an uncompromising extreme and with such vertigo. Even after the moral implications of the narrative are unpacked, the affective mediation of the cinematic images offer more than sympathy for the wrong player in the national drama of corporate fraud and private grief. Morally reassuring film narratives that show suffering in times of crisis articulate themselves around melodramatic or neo-realist lines. They effectively mediate the moment of crisis through images taken from the realm of the everyday life and a spectacle of suffering where genre conventions are still present. Melodrama, of course, is another affective genre. It is one of the three genres Linda Williams considers body genres, the other two being pornography and horror. While El Desconocido adds to the imagescape of the crisis, remains a blunter, more disturbing and more ambivalent string of visceral reaction in which the pleasure of having a shady investing banker paying dearly for what he did is not completely suppressed by the comfort of proper generic ending. As much as the banker is saved by the loss of the genre and cleansed by a personal ordeal somewhat commensurable with what he has made others go through, the fantasy of retribution remains at that primal level of rage and indignation. While it can be argued that the film engages frivolously with a national financial crisis, it may be likewise reasoned that at a deeper level, El Desconocido certainly responds to the crisis of fantasies that supplement the current crisis of the neoliberal state. That crisis of fantasies had a very specific meaning in Berland's cinema of precarity. Just a second. The fantasies that, in her words, are fraying since the 1990s in the globalized neoliberal West include upward mobility, job security, political and social equality, and lively and durable intimacy. The frayed fantasies that El Desconocido addresses in particular are social justice and institutional accountability. However, it addresses them at that visceral level, in that affective mediated presence of danger, where the morality lessons to be had are certainly troubling. The utopian fantasy of accountability is conflated with a more primal fantasy of making bankers pay for the pain they have caused. These conflicting effects reflect more pointedly the raw rage and the intense level of frustrations in the face of a system that favors the powerful and the affluent. Now, let me finish with some general reflections cherry-picked from this section of Filmspanism. To ask for the social function of the thriller as a mass genre in the neoliberal market of cultural goods should not be discounted offhand as naive. A more productive question would be how these crisis thrillers fit in the larger process of crisis representation. For the Spanish crisis has been certainly represented in a variety of ways and media, yet the guiding assumption here is that the crisis itself becomes an image-producing event where affective mediation has arguably the same, if not more weight than explanation, portrayal, or narration. As commodities, some of these images have a large-scale exchange value. Would Marx accept the term large-scale streaming value? As documents, others inhabit a more restricted field, if you will. They are certainly consumed in a different way. And the questions here are, how do they become more than an assortment of images readily accessible in a variety of media? How can one avoid the risk of correlation without causation? To speak of constellation in a Benjaminian sense offers some provisional answers to these questions. The image-scape provides the visual sphere in which to reconfigure actual visual phenomena that can be both grouped together and revealed by the cluster of individual stars. I love Benjamin. Conceptual rearrangement are then possible and even necessary. The media involved in this image producing activity is no doubt important as well as a mode of circulation and consumption. Yet more important, I would argue, is to reflect on the ontology of the image in the era of high neoliberalism, to paraphrase the famous title. Likewise, what the aesthetic of neoliberalism means should trigger a conversation that goes beyond questions of political economy. Going back to my thrilling crisis, the mix of reaction and reflection these moving images may elicit from their audiences should be part of a much more comprehensive examination of the relation among images, affects, and thoughts in times of a national and systemic crisis. That's all. End of the fourth presentation. Thank you.